You're listening to episode 52 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Our guest today, Matteo Pistono, speaks with us about his new book, In the Shadow of the Buddha, Secret Journeys, Sacred Histories, and Spiritual Discovery in Tibet. Many of us have an oblique understanding of alleged human rights abuses against the Tibetan people by the Chinese government. We know the Dalai Lama fled his homeland, but what he was fleeing and what is currently going on in Tibet is something of a mystery to many of us. Social engagement and activism have always been a part of Buddhism. There is no period in history in which it has not played a role in some way impacting the society in which it's found. Tibet is one of sadly many places in which basic human rights have taken a beating from the interests of political power. China does a very effective job of obfuscating what is happening to the people of Tibet, to their culture, to their freedoms. Matteo Pistono is a writer, practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism, and author of In the Shadow of the Buddha, Secret Journeys, Sacred Histories, and Spiritual Discovery in Tibet. Pistono was born and raised in Wyoming, where he completed his undergraduate degree in anthropology from the University of Wyoming, and in 1997 he obtained his Master of Arts degree in Indian philosophy from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. After working with the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. on Tibetan cultural programs, Pistono lived and traveled throughout the Himalayas for a decade, bringing to the West graphic accounts and photos of China's human rights abuses in Tibet. He is founder of Nikorpa, a foundation working to protect sacred pilgrimage sites around the world, and he sits on the Executive Council of the International Network of Engaged Buddhists, Rigpa Fellowship, and the Conservancy for Tibetan Art and Culture. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice butter tea in honor of our Tibetan topic for today. And today we are speaking with Matteo Pistono. Matteo, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Ted.
You know, it's not very often that I'm taking a look at Facebook. I mean, that in itself is not very often, but I was out there and I got to read something that one of my friends, who is Matteo, posted. Yep, my book is released, about to start the book tour. And I took a look at that, and you have just published a book called In the Shadow of the Buddha, Secret Journeys, Sacred Histories, and Spiritual Discovery in Tibet. And that's one of our topics of conversation today. But what I would like, Matteo, is for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you first encountered Buddhism.
I first encountered Buddhism in Nepal in the mid-1990s. I had finished my undergraduate, and I went to work on a political campaign, a gubernatorial campaign, and I was their field manager. I was brought up in a very in a political environment. My mother and father were both politically active, and so I had that kind of that perspective. So after I got done with university and I was running this political campaign in 1994, we lost. Though just days before we were definitely the front runner. But if we remember 1994, it was the neoconservative sort of tidal wave contract with America, and we were one of the casualties out in the Rocky Mountain West. And I wanted to, after that, I sort of lost a bit of confidence in the voters to sort of do the right thing, and I just wanted to get away. So I decided to go to Nepal to volunteer at a school. I had made a contact with a local school, and they welcomed me to come there. So I arrived. They put me up with a Tibetan family living on the outskirts of Kathmandu to live with. And I started teaching, but it was there that I sort of saw Tibetan Buddhism in a cultural context, the family who I was living with. And very quickly I was interested, and I was directed to go meet a few Tibetan refugee lamas. And after a few months of teaching and a break came about, I decided to study meditation a bit more formally at a monastery. And for about the next 6 months, I stayed at this monastery in Kathmandu, and or just outside, and studied and learned about Buddhism. And it was something that I didn't go to Nepal sort of on a spiritual path, as I said I was going there to teach, but it was something that definitely resonated with me. I'd been raised Catholic, Roman Catholic, and it was a path that I had sort of let go some years before, not sort of in an angry kind of a way, but I just knew that it wasn't my path. And so when I went to Nepal, I bumped into Buddhism really, but it really made sense. The teachings on cause and effect, and on how things are interdependent, how there aren't things that are out there that are independent, but most importantly, I think it was during that time that I had glimpses of my own mind in a non-thinking state. Just the mind that is clear, that is knowing, that is aware, but without thoughts. And this was a very powerful experience that I had sitting above Kathmandu, sort of looking out into the smog. And and it was something that led me. Then I left when I left Nepal after about a year or so. I went to graduate school in London to study Buddhist philosophy, and I ended up doing my master's there at the School of Oriental and African Studies in Buddhism. And so that was sort of how I got involved. It was definitely through the practice of meditation that I got involved in Buddhism, you could say.
And you then ended up working at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington on Tibetan cultural programs?
Correct, yes. After I came back from London, I went to work in Washington, and I got a job at the Smithsonian Institution to work on a program that was highlighting Tibetan culture in exile. And it was a large program. We had about 1.5 million people come over a 2-week period, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama and hundreds of other Tibetans that we brought from about 10 different countries. And it was a great experience and very much exposed me to the plight of the Tibetan people. Of course, I'd seen that in Nepal, and I was living with a refugee family. But it wasn't. But I like many folks that were expats that were in Nepal, I was a little bit caught up in my own gig, in my own meditation practice and whatnot. So I knew about about the political problems, but I didn't necessarily engage straight away at that time, because I had just come from Wyoming, where we, after running this political campaign, and I was sort of taking a break. But when I came back and I was working at the Smithsonian on this program with the Conservancy for Tibetan Art and Culture, there was these two organizations. I really saw the plight of the Tibetan refugees and the political problems. And at the conclusion of that stint with working with the Smithsonian, I wanted to go back to Nepal, to go back on to the sort of meditator's path, a little bit more aware of the political context. So I went back to Nepal, and I got a job. I sort of started to do some freelance journalism and writing, and started making trips into Tibet because I wanted to begin to go on a pilgrimage to study the life and teachings of a Tibetan mystic from the 19th century. His name was Terchen Sogyal, and he was a teacher to the 13th Dalai Lama, who is the predecessor to the current Dalai Lama. And he was an individual who was renowned for the power of his spiritual practice, so much so that the Tibetan government sort of summoned him to Lhasa and said, "Hey, we need you to be our tantric defense minister, and you need to defend." And so it was he who led the tantric charge against the Young Husband expedition in 1904, and later the Muslim warlords in northeastern Tibet. He used his spiritual power against them. So I was interested in this individual who was such a strong practitioner, such a strong meditator, but who was engaged very much in political activity. So I was in Nepal doing this freelance journalism, but began making these trips into Tibet. And there, you don't have to look very far, Ted, to see the injustice, just what the Tibetans are going through. And it wasn't long before the Tibetans with whom I was interacting, because I started to go back fairly frequently. Over the course of the next 8 or 9 years, I took more than 15 trips to all corners of the Tibetan plateau. And it was early on that the Tibetans asked me to begin to spirit out first-hand accounts of human rights abuses. And they began pointing out prisons where monks and nuns are held for their political beliefs, for not denouncing the Dalai Lama. They're thrown into prison. And so I began photographing these secret prisons. And I began to bring back this information to the West, to Western advocacy groups such as the International Campaign for Tibet, and eventually to the U.S. government, to folks within the U.S. State Department and National Security Council. And it began this, I went there on a Buddhist pilgrimage to try to study the life and teachings of Terchen Sogyal, and it ended up, just the circumstances that presented themselves to me, I couldn't deny, I couldn't say no. All of my teachers, what they were teaching me was, when something is in front of you, you need to act compassionately towards whatever situation arises. So this in Tibet, it was just, it began to be a regular occurrence where the Tibetans who I talked to were passing this information on to me, and then I began to seek out the information, and these form the two narratives of the book, In the Shadow of the Buddha. One is the life and teachings of Terchen Sogyal, this 19th century mystic, and the other is my journey in his footsteps, which took this unexpected turn to working on human rights in Tibet and in China.
Mm-hmm. It's funny in seeing one of the videos that's available online, and for folks who are listening to this from iTunes, I suggest going out to the website, Matteo's website, www.matteopistono.com, and that's MatteoPistono.com. You've got sections of the book there, and you tell a little bit about the story, and there are some videos. And I was looking at these a week or so ago when we first started emailing about doing the interview about the book, and I was very floored because we in the West know in a removed sort of way that, yes, there are violations of human rights going on in China against the Tibetan people. This is something that we're very familiar with. But to actually see what you have, and I think some of this is on the website, and I know there are parts of it in the video and certainly in the book, that you have photos of these prisons, and where us as secular Buddhist folks who are typically listening to the podcast, is that the idea that people are not allowed to practice whatever their tradition is freely and without constraint by someone else is repugnant and reprehensible to us. And it's interesting that you went there as a pilgrim to learn more because you had done this meditation and you were starting to see some transformation in your own life, and you went back to continue with that. But couldn't, and I suspect in part because of the practice, could not turn away in what often we in the West have as a reflex to not face things that are unpleasant to us, even when surrounded by that. And for you, that changed.
Yeah. It did. I mean, like I said, when you meet some of the Tibetans who have undergone extreme situations, imprisonment, abuse, torture, and when I would say, well, what did you do before your imprisonment? What did you do before to be thrown into jail? And to have these, very short, sort of small nuns telling me that they walked around to a public square and they said, "Long live the Dalai Lama." And so for that, they're thrown into prison for years and years, thrown into solitary confinement. And it's something, as you said, we read about, we kind of know here in the West, we know these things are going on, but to sit there and listen, and eventually, as I was videotaping these type of things, it's very, very powerful, and you, at least from my perspective, there's nothing else to do than try to fight for their justice, for what they believe. And Ted, the Dalai Lama once, I heard him say early on when I first saw him, when I went to Nepal, I got into India for a bit, and then later when I was able to meet with him, he sort of reiterated the same point, was this idea of bearing witness.
Yeah.
That,
yeah.
And for this reason, he says, he doesn't say don't go to Tibet. He says definitely go to Tibet, and then come back and talk about what you see.
Yeah.
I just had to happen in a situation where I went to Tibet over the course of nearly a decade, many trips for months on end there, where it was bearing witness, but then it was became it became what the Chinese would call revealing state secrets. This is not things that the People's Republic of China's government wants people to know about, and this evidence is if in the book some of the things, or in that video that you talked about, seem extreme, such as going above, getting a bird's eye view of prisons with a long lens. I was taking pictures of prisons, or the extreme ways that we work to get information out through cyberspace, and also just through, essentially smuggling information out. If they seem extreme, it's only because the Chinese government is a closed government. It's an authoritarian regime that doesn't want information out. So we had to go, people have to go to extreme measures to get the truth out.
What sounds like what you have here is, part of the book is an adventure, but it's a dark adventure. It's not a fun adventure. This is one where people's lives and not just, you're thrown in jail for a day or two for misbehavior. No, years and years for saying a sentence. And that's something we just don't experience here in the West. And you could see that kind of thing. And now you mentioned that you needed to get pictures and videos and things like that out. Are you able to speak a little bit about how you would get some things out of the country and out publicly in the West?
Sure. And I talk about a few of these methods in the book, just to try to again show the kind of extreme lengths that human rights monitors have to go to in China. And elsewhere in the world. It's not like there's many more people who are doing this type of work. But some of the methods, the physical documents, say for example, documentation of China's push to have Tibetans not use Tibetan. That is the signification where they just use Mandarin. I was able to get my hands on actual government documents that talked about the reasoning for this in the eastern part of Tibet, in an area called Kanze. So these are documents that, because China says they're not doing this, but if we have their own words that say it, it's much more powerful than advocacy groups saying that Tibet says, or that China says it. In the same way, China says, the Dalai Lama is welcome back here. But when we have, the Dalai Lama is welcome to come back to Tibet. But when we have court documents, like some of the ones that I brought out, that say monks who hold up pictures of the Dalai Lama, for that they received a 5-year prison sentence. This is the Chinese judicial system articulating itself on its own terms. And it's very powerful for human rights groups because, it's China admitting their own moral error, if you will. So these hard documents, I would take out and just, in different ways to smuggle them out. Sometimes on my person, hidden in various places, such as just the old school way of just putting, sewing them into backpack straps or false bottoms in bags. And eventually, this was when I first went there, was in the late 1990s, when by the by 2003, 2004, I was trying to send more out, through the internet, but this was something I had to be shown and taught how to do. And I talk about this in the book, where at one point I would travel with a CD that, if you were able to reboot a computer, such as in a cyber cafe, it with that CD in the drive, you're able to circumvent any keystroke recognition technology or any screenshots. These are two of the ways that the Chinese cyber police monitor activity in Tibetan areas, by keystroke recognition and screenshots. So what the CD does is it creates a temporary memory in cyberspace where it stores that information instead of on the computer's hard drive itself. And I could do my work. I could type up the messages. I could send out photographs and whatnot to encrypted sites in the West. And then when I took that CD out, I turned the computer off actually, and then removed the CD, that information would vanish from the knowledge of the cyber police. And so, we had to go to, these kind of lengths to try to get these photographs and documentation out.
Mm-hmm. Now, you saw a lot of very unpleasant and hard things there. What were some of the most challenging for you to actually see, and what impacted you the greatest of the things that you saw while you were there? And this is over a span of about 10 years.
Yeah. Well, what probably impacted me the greatest was just the day-to-day devotion and resolve of the Tibetan people in the face of an ever-growing opposition to their religious faith and even their cultural heritage. Tibetans. It was my experience, the Tibetans who I spoke to, that their devotion to the Dalai Lama, their belief, or their sense, their belief in Tibetan Buddhism, their devotion to the Dalai Lama, and their sense of nationhood or nationalism is inextricably linked. You can't kind of separate these. So to see how Tibetan what they had to go through just to pray to the Dalai Lama, just to it's very meaningful, for example, for Tibetan to wear an amulet, to wear a small picture of the Dalai Lama, and this they would have to sometimes hide inside their cowboy hats, not have it revealed. They would get up at the middle of the night to go circumambulate a temple on auspicious days such as the Dalai Lama's birthday. And this is just this day-to-day situation that the Tibetans go through, that I saw how they dealt with that. And these very sort of extraordinary ways that they dealt with it was so inspiring. It was so inspiring because you sort of see what devotion to a spiritual path means, the lengths that they'll go to just to be able to express their Buddhist faith.
So what did you see in your time there, and now having written the book and seeing that you've delivered a lot of information that needed to be delivered, and you're getting the message out there, and hopefully from this interview and others that you've done on this, which have been terrific, what do you think may be some next steps that could happen to help change things? What are you hoping for?
Yeah. During this period that I was doing the work for about a decade or so, bringing the information out and working with the International Campaign for Tibet and the U.S. and other Western governments, we're always pushing for expanded freedoms in China and in Tibet, such as freedom of religious expression, freedom of peaceful political expression, these type of things. And on the specific Tibet issue, always pushing for the Chinese leadership to actually sit down face to face with the Dalai Lama, to invite the Dalai Lama to China and say, hey, let's have real discussions to figure out how Tibetans can make decisions in Tibet. The Chinese Constitution guarantees autonomy in Tibet and other areas that they call minority areas. And the Dalai Lama, since the late 1980s, has said, okay, Tibetans, we aren't going to seek independence, and we're not going to discuss history, but from now forward, all we're asking for is genuine autonomy within the People's Republic of China. That's what the Dalai Lama's position is. So, and for the last, during my work and during those years, and then since then, trying to use human rights information to impress upon other governments to push China to do the same thing, to sit down with the Dalai Lama to talk about how Tibetans can be put in a position to make the decisions in Tibet. But it's a difficult proposition with how China is positioning themselves, how they are feeling. It's clear the Chinese government feels very confident these days. And if we just take how, if we look at what happened in 1989 during Tiananmen Square, and the repercussions, the real economic repercussions of that, there weren't many. I mean, the U.S. sanctioned China for a while after that, but the idea that there will be real economic detriment, that there'll be some sort of detriment to the Chinese economy or somehow investors in China because of their lack of allowing human rights and social justice issues, it doesn't seem to be happening right now. I mean, it's clear, but of course that doesn't mean that we could ever stop working for that. It's all the more reason that we have to redouble our efforts and figure out new and innovative ways. Because if there's anything that the very first thing I studied in Buddhism was about impermanence. And I thought long and hard about that. Like, how does impermanence, and you could sort of see from the subtle aspects of the impermanence of physical form to the impermanence of the movement of thought to these types of, this essential truth that the Buddha taught is also applicable to China and Chinese political system and the Chinese Communist Party. So, so the Chinese Communist Party is not going to be around forever. That's a fact. I mean, I can say that certainly. I can say that as I can be as certain of that as I am my own death. That those two things will happen. But of course, in America, we want things to happen like yesterday. We're not very patient, but we still, regarding hope. I mean, I don't say I think I work in politics. I work a little bit more sort of pragmatically. I don't try to work so much on hope, and that's why the documentation of human rights abuses was something that was very important for me. And one thing with the current, what's happening in Egypt right now, and which will likely be happening at other places around the Middle East. The Chinese government has blocked any search engines for words like Tunisia, Egypt, Cairo, this type of thing. This is the last thing that China wants. You saw what they did in 1989 when a similar uprising took place in Tiananmen Square. So it's the last thing, because China, the Chinese Communist Party's overriding psychological driving force is fear of dissolution of the state. And they have this, and that's why they keep an iron fist on Tibet. They keep an iron fist on Xinjiang. If any one of these areas might break away, like we saw in the former Soviet Union, in the Eastern Bloc countries, China has studied that very carefully, and that is what they absolutely they'll do everything not to allow that to happen. And that is the reason why they are so heavy-handed in Tibet. And it's the reason why they disdain the Dalai Lama, because they believe the Dalai Lama is pushing for this separation of Tibet from China. Although he stated for decades that he's not.
Right. It's interesting that you brought up the Egypt situation as we were recording this for people who were listening to it a few weeks hence. Egypt has people in their Freedom Square, and they are going through what may not be, who knows what it looks like in a few weeks or even a few days, a significant cultural revolution. And what we're seeing, and I think part of what you're saying, Matteo, is that if one area is able to have a successful secession or uprising, that may very well be a floodgate for change, and that is one that people would carry forward, as we're seeing with Egypt now, and that's something that they absolutely do not want, and one reason they're having that iron fist control that you're talking about.
Exactly, it's exactly that. The fear of the splitting up of China, and China has, the Chinese government has some historical, I wouldn't say justification, but they have in their own mind. You can sort of see, if you take from their perspective, what the challenges that they face with what they call Western imperialism, and I would probably agree with it, and during the Opium Wars and whatnot. They see this as a struggle between imperial forces that want to split them. And they see the Tibetans as being supported by a Western imperialist government, that is, the United States. I mean, this isn't like secret documents here. This is their stated, we have Chinese Communist Party members that regularly call the United States a Western imperialistic power. And I'm not here to say if it is or if it isn't, but that's the dynamic that China, the psychological dynamic that's going on in their mind, where they feel as though Tibet is going to have this secessionist movement.
Yeah. And one of the other things you touched on was the idea that we haven't yet seen a successful change in the situation of the Tibetan people in China and their former homeland, but it doesn't mean that we should stop working for sustainable, meaningful, lasting change.
Not at all. I mean, I when you just said that, I just had this sort of tweet in my mind come up that was a few days ago, and it said, yesterday Tunisia, today Egypt, tomorrow, and it had just a blank.
Yeah.
And is that going to be? Is that going to be China? Is that going to be Tibet? There's not saying that it couldn't be. Because I mean, there is a tipping point to these things, and Tibet is not the only restive area in China today. They literally have hundreds of thousands of demonstrations every year for various social reasons, for various social ills in China. The Chinese state media tries to keep a lid on this. But for anybody who is a China watcher, they know that these things are happening for various reasons, mostly economic marginalization, but many social as well. So the Communist Party has Tibet is not their only problem, and it's the problems that the Communist Party has, because they don't deal with them in a manner which is, beneficial for the people, but rather the overriding principle, the idea that the Communist Party has, as I'll say it again, is to keep the cohesion, this harmony, what they call harmonious society, is a bit of a euphemism for keeping the state together, not having people, sort of come up in arms, or tweeting or blogging, or these, and this is why they have their Chinese firewall, the great Chinese firewall.
I want to take a slight detour from what we've been talking about and have you chat for a few minutes about another organization that you're associated with, that is nekorpa.org, and that's NEKORPA.org. Tell us about that.
Yeah. During this decade or so, I was traveling around Tibet. I was always going to pilgrimage sites. I never stopped my pilgrimage in a way. I was just also busy doing other things. But I very much appreciated the going to these sacred locations, these physical sacred locations around Tibet, a little bit in China, and extensively in Nepal and in India. And at the beginning, actually my first trip to Tibet, when I went to meet a teacher by the name of Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok, and I told him that I wanted to study the teachings of this mystic, he said, "Oh, you should go to these 4 places." He sort of mapped out where I should go, and it took me about a decade. When I went to the last one is when I actually, the human rights work also sort of came to an end as well, because it's not like a Westerner can continue to do this work, for long periods of time in China. It's a bit, because the risk of not of so much me getting caught, but of the Chinese finding out what I was doing and individuals who I was communicating with. So, but at the very end, I went to this last of the 4 places, and it was there that I thought, I want to give something back to these sacred locations. Of course, I was doing the political work, but I want to give something back to these power places, that have been imbued with power and blessing for centuries and centuries. Because I'm from Wyoming, so I kind of think of myself as a salt of the earth kind of a guy. I'm not super trippy, but when you go to these places, you can feel the power. There's something that goes on that the physical space affects your mind. So I decided to found this organization called Nekorpa, which means pilgrim in Tibetan. Ne means sacred location, and Kor means to walk around, and Pa means like a person. So Nekorpa, as a pilgrim. And so I founded this organization and got a few advisors and a few people to support me. And we're working at pilgrimage sites, doing principally 3 things. The first is that we, if it's trashed or if it's facing some sort of environmental pressures, destruction, we're working to clean them up. So in some of the places we're working on sanitation, some water issues, some trash issues, these type of things. The second aspect is to write modern day, multilingual pilgrimage guides. Because I saw very clearly how in Tibet, with the loss of tradition bearers, with the elderly, much of the oral history, oftentimes a single individual can hold an oral history for a single sacred site. And when that person dies, that lineage of knowledge ceases. And also that's not, as well as the sort of pressures of modernity. I was in Eastern Tibet once, and there was a mountain that was sort of shaped like a vase, like a flower vase. And in Tibetan, the hill was called Vase Mountain, or Bumbari, it was called. But the friend of mine says, "Hey, look at this Chinese guidebook. It says that name of that mountain is Steamed Bun Mountain, because it looks like 2 steamed buns, like dumplings on top of each other." And he laughed at it, but I thought, that is such a shame, because the more people call that Steam Bun Mountain, people will forget why it was called this other sacred name, Bumpari. So that's what, with this, so the second aspect of New Corpo's work, we're cleaning up the place, doing environmental work. The second aspect is to publish these pilgrimage guidebooks that focus on oral history as well as textual sources, but principally oral history. Just put that down in writing and have it and sort of mark it at this time in history. And the third thing is that we're supporting yogis and meditators who are at these places, who are actually imbuing the location with power today, with practices. So we're supporting them. And we're working right now. The first place we worked was actually, the first site was in Tibet, in the eastern part of Tibet. And now we're working in Nepal and in Sri Lanka. And we have some sites, some project sites planned this year for India and in Mongolia as well.
Uh-huh. Excellent.
Yeah, it's really exciting work, and it's pretty non-political in a way. But if you think about trying to preserve the names in at least in Tibet, in Tibetan for all of these places, actually that's a very political endeavor because of the force of what the Chinese government is trying to do in Tibet.
Matteo, thank you so much for being here. Folks who are listening to the podcast, we've been speaking with Matteo Pistono, and he can find him at www.matteopistono.com. That's MatteoPistono.com. The book is In the Shadow of the Buddha, Secret Journeys, Sacred Histories, and Spiritual Discovery in Tibet. Matteo, thank you so much for being here. This has been terrific.
Thanks a lot, Ted, and I really appreciate your interest in this sort of contemporary situation inside Tibet, because while there's this huge interest in Tibetan Buddhism in the West, the struggle for the Tibetan life force is still with the 5.5 million Tibetans who live in Tibet.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to get that message out there. Thank you so much for writing the book.
Yeah, well, my pleasure. Thanks a lot, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.